The Officers' Club at Naval Special Warfare Center Coronado had hosted victories before, promotions, homecomings, quiet toasts to missions no one would ever name. Its walls were thick with history and tobacco, darkened stories, the kind passed hand to hand with a glass and a nod. But that night, the room felt stripped of warmth, as if someone had opened a door to the Pacific and let the cold creep in. 250 operators filled the space shoulder to shoulder, blues and whites pressed sharp, metals catching the amber light. The bar hummed softly, ice clinked, a bottle turned, a laugh started and died halfway through. The air wasn't celebratory, it was evaluative, like a practical exam where the subject didn't know the questions yet. Lieutenant Cara Thorne stood near the bar, centered but alone. Her posture was textbook, heels aligned, shoulders square, chin level. Hands rested easily at her sides, fingers loose, not clasped. To the untrained eye, it looked like stillness. To anyone who'd spent time in a stack or a surf zone, it was readiness disguised as calm. The gold trident on her chest glinted when she shifted her weight, a subtle flash that drew attention like a flare. Every time it caught the light, the whispers grew. Standards, politics, timing. Someone laughed softly behind a glass. Someone else cleared their throat too loudly. Eyes moved. Some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. A few held something else entirely. Calculation. Not everyone in the room opposed her presence, but uncertainty is a louder companion than approval, and it had found a seat at every table. Cara felt the room without turning her head. She felt the angle of glances, the way conversations bent when she passed the edge of them. She'd learned long ago that attention was a tool. If you let it pull you off center, it owned you, so she didn't. She breathed once, slow and measured, the way instructors taught you to reset before a dive. Across the room, Lieutenant Commander Bryce Reaper Hawkins held court. He was built like the stories said he should be, broad shoulders, knuckles scarred pale, hair cut to regulation and defiance all at once. A drink rested in his hand, untouched long enough to suggest he was savoring the moment more than the alcohol. He didn't lower his voice when he spoke. He never did. That was the point. So this is how history's made now, Hawkins said, lifting his glass just enough to draw eyes. By committee. A ripple of laughter followed him, uneven and sharp. Not everyone joined in, but enough did to give him permission. Hawkins smiled the way men do when they know the room is with them, or at least not against them. Cara didn't look over. She didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on a point just beyond the bar's mirrored shelves. She could feel the weight of the words pressing, trying to find a crack. She gave them none. Hawkins took a step closer, then another, his boots deliberate on the hardwood. The distance between them narrowed in inches that felt like yards. He lowered his voice, not out of respect, but to make it intimate, personal. "Nothing against you, Lieutenant," he said, and the lie sat heavy between them. Just wondering what corners got cut. Behind him, someone muttered agreement. Someone else looked away. At the far end of the room, Colonel Declan Thorne watched. He stood with his back to the wall, hands loosely clasped, a glass untouched in his grip. His expression was calm, but his eyes were anything but. He'd read rooms like this for decades, briefings that turned, negotiations that soured, moments when pride and alcohol made men forget where they were. He had seen the arc of this night, the instant his daughter walked through the door, and the noise dipped half a degree. He knew Hawkins, knew the type, men who mistook volume for authority and crowds for courage. Cara felt Hawkins' presence now, close enough to smell the alcohol on his breath, close enough that the room seemed to lean in. She kept her hands relaxed, kept her breathing steady. If she moved first, the story would write itself without her consent. The club went quiet in the way rooms do when something irreversible approaches. Conversations stalled, glasses paused midair. 250 operators inhaled at once. Hawkins shifted his stance, his smile thinned. And then his hand began to move. Lieutenant Cara Thorne had learned long before she earned the gold trident that stillness could be louder than motion. In surf, stillness meant conserving oxygen. In a stack, it meant patience before violence. In a room like this, inside the officers' club at Naval Special Warfare Center, Coronado, it meant refusing to give the crowd what it wanted. Hawkins' hand moved through the air, not fast enough to be accidental, not slow enough to be ignored. A gesture meant to dominate space, to remind her, and everyone watching, who he believed belonged where. The distance between them collapsed to something intimate and dangerous. Cara didn't step back. Her eyes shifted for the first time, lifting to meet his. They were steady, unblinking, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. It was the look she'd used on rough seas and worse men, the kind that said, "I see you clearly, and I am not impressed." In that instant, the room learned something it hadn't expected. Cara's calm wasn't performative. It wasn't the quiet of someone hoping the storm would pass. It was the composure of someone who had already survived far worse than social cruelty and public doubt. Her body remembered nights where silence meant survival, where a single breath out of rhythm could cost lives. This room, this man, registered as noise. She shifted her weight subtly, heel aligning, center dropping a fraction. Anyone trained would have recognized it as preparation, but only the trained would notice. To the rest, it looked like nothing at all. Hawkins' fingers stopped inches from her sleeve. The pause stretched. Too long, long enough for uncertainty to creep in where confidence had been. His grin faltered just slightly, as if his mind had finally caught up to what his body was doing. He hadn't expected resistance in this form. He'd expected flinch, anger, tears, something he could point to afterward and say, "See." Cara gave him none of it. Around them, the club existed in suspended animation. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. One man near the bar stared at the trident on her chest, the metal bright under the lights, and looked away as if burned. Others watched with narrowed eyes, reassessing, recalibrating. Cara spoke then, quietly. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, her voice even, respectful, and unmistakably firm. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. The room leaned in again, drawn by the restraint in her tone. There was no accusation in it. No plea, just a line drawn cleanly in the air between them. Hawkins scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. "Relax," he said, "just talking." Her gaze didn't waver. "Then talk," she replied, without touching. It was a small sentence. A simple one, but it landed with the weight of policy, training, and expectation behind it. It wasn't a threat. It was a standard, clearly stated, calmly enforced. For the first time, Hawkins looked around. He became aware of eyes not laughing now, but watching him, measuring him. The permission he'd felt moments earlier had thinned, replaced by something colder, scrutiny. Cara felt it shift too. She felt the room begin to split, not along rank or reputation, but along something more uncomfortable. Respect, the kind that isn't given freely and can't be demanded, the kind earned quietly, often without witnesses. Her thoughts flickered briefly, unbidden, early mornings, salt in her mouth, hands raw and bleeding on cold steel. The voice of an instructor telling her to quit, telling her she didn't belong. She remembered not the words, but the decision she'd made in response to stay. She was still staying. Hawkins withdrew his hand, masking the retreat with a shrug. "Didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. Cara inclined her head a fraction, not a bow, an acknowledgement. She returned her gaze forward, recentering, as if the moment had already passed, but it hadn't. Across the room, Colonel Declan Thorne exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to register. He'd known his daughter could handle herself. Knowing and seeing were different things. The club's noise began to return, cautiously at first. Glasses clinked. Conversations restarted in lower tones. But something fundamental had changed. The test everyone had felt building hadn't failed in public. It had been answered, and not the way they expected. Lieutenant Commander Bryce Reaper Hawkins had built his reputation on momentum. In training, in combat, in rooms like this, he thrived on forward motion. Press hard, speak louder, move first. Hesitation, he believed, was weakness, and weakness was something you exposed in others before it could ever be seen in you. For years, it had worked. Men laughed when he laughed, fell silent when he spoke, backed down when he closed distance. But as he stood there in the officers' club at Naval Special Warfare Center Coronado, drink warm in his hand, something unfamiliar began to gnaw at him. Stall. The room hadn't erupted the way it should have. There was no satisfying release of tension, no easy applause to confirm he'd been right all along. Instead, the space around him felt thin, as if the air itself had decided to step back. The eyes on him now weren't approving. They were analytical. Hawkins took a sip he didn't need and set the glass down harder than necessary. "You all act like I committed a crime," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "I asked a question. No one answered." That silence, measured, collective, hit harder than any rebuttal. Hawkins had never feared confrontation, but being ignored, being weighed and found uninteresting, that was new. He glanced at Cara again. She stood exactly where she had before. Posture unchanged, attention forward. It was as if he had already been filed away in her mind as resolved, no longer worthy of focus. That dismissal, quiet and complete, pricked at something deeper than pride. It challenged the story he told himself about who mattered in a room like this. "So we're just pretending this isn't different now." He pressed, raising his voice a notch. That standards don't shift when politics get involved. A few heads turned away. One man at a nearby table frowned openly. Another checked his watch. The reactions were small, but Hawkins noticed them all. Momentum was slipping, and he didn't know how to grab it back without escalating. Cara turned then, not fully, just enough to face him again. Her expression remained composed, but there was a clarity in her eyes now, a sharpened focus. Not anger, precision. "Standards don't shift," she said. "They're enforced." The words landed cleanly, without ornament or challenge. Not a debate, a fact. Hawkins snorted. "You really believe that?" "I know it," she replied. The confidence in her voice was unforced, the kind that comes from repetition under pressure. Hawkins had heard that tone before, on radios in bad weather, in after-action debriefs that cut through bravado and excuses alike. He just never expected to hear it directed at him in this room. Murmurs stirred again, different this time. Less venom, more curiosity. A few officers exchanged looks, subtle nods passing between them. The conversation had shifted from "can she handle this" to "is he about to embarrass himself?" Hawkins felt the turn. He felt it and resented it. "You know what this place was built on," he said, gesturing around the club to the photos on the walls, the plaques etched with names. Men who pushed limits, men who didn't ask for permission. Cara followed his gesture with her eyes, scanning the history he invoked. When she spoke again, her voice softened, not with weakness, but with respect. "Every name up there earned their place by meeting the same standard," she said, "not by being shielded from it." The implication hung between them, sharp and unmistakable. Across the room, Colonel Declan Thorne shifted his stance. He didn't intervene, not yet. This wasn't his moment to claim. It was hers, and she was handling it exactly as she'd been trained, not just in combat, but in leadership. Hawkins opened his mouth, then closed it. He searched the room for support and found none he could rely on. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a careful distance. The crowd hadn't turned on him, but it had stepped aside. He laughed again, quieter this time. "Guess we'll see," he said, attempting a shrug. "History's full of surprises." "History," Cara replied, "is written by those who show up ready." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then someone near the bar nodded. Another raised a glass, not to Hawkins, not to Cara, but to the ideas she'd articulated. The idea that standards endured because people defended them, even when it was uncomfortable. Hawkins picked up his drink and drained it in one motion. He set the empty glass down, jaw tight, and took a step back, not in defeat. He would never admit that, but in recognition of a boundary he could no longer cross without consequence. The man who had mocked history found himself standing on the wrong side of it. And the room knew it.